Can I take your picture? Thank you. Oh, thanks. Welcome. Welcome to Cambridge Forum. I'm Charles Sennott. I'm the executive editor of GlobalPost, which is a new online news organization. I'm very excited about the conversation tonight and looking forward to hearing from Andrew. I want to introduce him. I've known Andrew for a long time, and I can't think of anyone who can provide us with more grounding and a sense of perspective for the very important questions we face as a country right now. Probably in the next few weeks, the Obama administration will have its most consequential foreign policy decision, whether or not to add more troops to Afghanistan. Andrew Bacevich understands the kinds of questions that need to be asked right now, and he provides a lot of answers to those questions as well. I just want to briefly introduce you to some of the aspects of his background that helped shape his experience. Professor Bacevich is a U.S. Military Academy graduate and served in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. After his experience in the war, he earned a PhD at Princeton. He was a member of the West Point faculty before joining Boston University. He was a very early critic of the Bush Doctrine, and he wrote extensively against U.S. military action in Iraq and Afghanistan. His points of view are shaped by experience, but also by a very human sense of loss. Tragically, on May 13th, 2007, Andrew's son, also named Andrew, 27, assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 8th U.S. Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division, was killed in action in Iraq. That's a very private loss for Andrew, and I'm not going to go into that in my questioning, and it's a private realm, but it's one that really does shape a lot of the way he comes at these issues, but not completely, as he will share with you. Andrew's knowledge, his experience is so vast and so important. It's really my great honor to introduce him. We'll hear from him for about 20 minutes. And then I will share a few minutes about my reporting on the ground, and then we will have a conversation. So with no further ado, may I introduce Andrew Bacevich.
That was a tremendously kind introduction, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to the Cambridge Forum, but I know that the real essence of the enterprise is the discussion, and you don't want to hear me blather on for a long time. So let me hop right to what I hope will be a fairly concise presentation that may stimulate some of our discussion. History deals rudely with the pretensions of those who presume to determine its course. In an American context, this describes the fate of those falling prey to what we might call the Wilsonian conceit. Yet the damage done by that conceit outlives its perpetrators. From time to time, in some moment of peril or anxiety, a statesman appears on the scene promising to eliminate tyranny, to ensure the universal triumph of liberty, and to achieve permanent peace. For a moment, the statesman achieves the status of prophet, one who in his own person seemingly embodies the essence of the American purpose. Then reality intrudes, exposing the promises as costly fantasies. The prophet's followers abandon him. Mocked and reviled, he is eventually banished, perhaps to some gated community in Dallas. Yet, however brief his ascendancy, the discredited prophet leaves behind a legacy. Most obvious are the problems created and left unresolved, commitments made and left unfulfilled, debts accrued and left unpaid. Less obvious, but for that reason all the more important, are the changes in perception. The prophet recasts our image of reality. Long after his departure, remnants of that image linger and retain their capacity to beguile. Consider how the Wilsonian vision of the United States as a crusader state called upon to redeem the world has periodically resurfaced, despite Woodrow Wilson's own manifest failure to make good on that promise. The prophet declaims and departs, yet traces of his testimony, however at odds with reality, remain lodged in our consciousness. So it is today with Afghanistan. The conflict that George W. Bush began, then ignored, and finally bequeathed to his successor. Barack Obama has now described this conflict as the war we must win. Bush's supporters might rightly view the prospect of Obama pressing on in Afghanistan as a vindication of sorts. Here we have a president whose run for high office derived its energy from an implicit promise to repudiate all that Bush had wrought, now urged to endorse the proposition that this remote, landlocked, primitive Central Asian country constitutes a vital U.S. national security interest. The candidate who once derided the notion that the United States is called upon to determine the fate of Iraq now considers the possibility of expending untold billions, not to mention who knows how many American lives, in order to determine the fate of Afghanistan. What is it about Afghanistan, possessing next to nothing that the United States requires, that justifies such lavish attention? In Washington, this question goes not only unanswered but unasked. Among Democrats and Republicans alike, Afghanistan's importance is simply assumed, much the way 50 years ago, otherwise intelligent people simply assumed that the United States had a vital interest in ensuring the preservation of South Vietnam. Yet as then, so too today, that assumption does not stand up to even casual scrutiny. The fight in Afghanistan is essential to keeping America safe, we are told. The events of September 11th, 2001 ostensibly occurred because we ignored Afghanistan. Preventing a recurrence of those events, therefore, requires that we fix the place. This widely accepted line of reasoning overlooks the primary reason why the 9/11 conspiracy succeeded, namely that federal, state, and local agencies responsible for commercial aviation security failed to install even minimally adequate security measures. We weren't paying attention. Consumed with its ABC agenda, you'll remember that, ABC, anything but Clinton. Consumed with its ABC agenda, the Bush administration in those days did not have its eye on the ball. So we got sucker punched. Averting another 9/11 does not require the semi-permanent occupation and pacification of Afghanistan. Rather, it requires the United States to erect and maintain robust defenses. Fixing Afghanistan is not only unnecessary, it's also likely to prove implausible. Not for nothing has the place acquired the nickname Graveyard of Empires. Of course, Americans, insistent that the dominion over which they preside does not meet the definition of empire, evince little interest in how others have fared in attempting to impose their will on the Afghans. As General David McKiernan, the hapless and recently departed U.S. commander in Afghanistan, put it, quote, "There's always an inclination to relate what we're doing with previous nations," adding, "I think that's a very unhealthy comparison." Now, McKiernan was expressing a view I think that's quite common among the ranks of the political and the military elite. We're Americans. We're different. Therefore, the experience of others need not apply. Of course, Americans like McKiernan, who reject as irrelevant the experience of others, might at least be willing to contemplate the experience of the United States itself. Take the case of Iraq, now bizarrely portrayed in some quarters as a success, and even more bizarrely seen as offering a template for how to turn Afghanistan around. 6+ years after it began, Operation Iraqi Freedom has consumed something like $1 trillion, with the meter still running, and has taken the lives of over 4,300 American soldiers. Meanwhile, in Baghdad and other major Iraqi cities, car bombs continue to detonate at regular intervals, killing and maiming dozens. Given the embarrassing and yet indisputable fact that this was an utterly needless war, no weapons of mass destruction found, no ties between Saddam Hussein and the jihadists established, no democratic transformation of the Islamic world set in motion, no road to peace in Jerusalem found in downtown Baghdad. To describe Iraq as a success, much less as anything that should serve as a model for application elsewhere, falls nothing short of being obscene. For those who, despite all this, still hanker to have a go at nation building, why start with Afghanistan? Why not first fix, say, Mexico? In terms of its importance to the United States, our southern neighbor, a major supplier of both oil and drugs, among other commodities deemed vital to the American way of life, Mexico outranks Afghanistan in importance to the United States by several orders of magnitude. And for those who purport to believe that moral considerations rather than self-interest should inform foreign policy, there too Mexico qualifies for priority attention. Consider the theft of California. Or consider more recently how the American appetite for illicit drugs and our liberal gun laws have corroded Mexican institutions and produced an epidemic of violence afflicting ordinary Mexicans. Bluntly, we owe these people big time. Yet any politician or pundit suggesting that the United States ought to commit 100,000 or so U.S. troops, backed by a generously funded multi-year effort aimed at eliminating Mexican drug trafficking and corruption, would be laughed out of Washington, and rightly so. Any proposal that the United States ought to take on the task of establishing in Mexico City effective mechanisms of governance, endowing Mexico with competent security forces, and reforming the Mexican school system while protecting the rights of Mexican women, will anybody proposing that sort of notion, they'd never make it to the floor of Congress for a vote. Meanwhile, those who promote such programs for Afghanistan, ignoring questions of cost and ignoring as well the corruption and ineffectiveness that pervade our own institutions, well, those people get treated like sages. The contrast between Washington's preoccupation with Afghanistan and its relative indifference to Mexico testifies to the distortion of U.S. national security priorities induced by George W. Bush in his post-9/11 prophetic mode. Distortions now being perpetuated by Bush's successor. It also testifies to a vast failure of imagination to which our governing classes have succumbed. This failure of imagination makes it literally impossible for those who possess either authority or influence in Washington to consider the possibility, A, that the solution to America's problems is to be found not out there, where there in this case is Central Asia, but here at home. B, that the people out there, rather than requiring our administrations, may well be capable of managing their own affairs, relying on their own methods. And C, that to disregard A and B is to open the door to great mischief, and in all likelihood to perpetrate no small amount of evil. Now, needless to say, when mischief or evil occur, when a stray American bomb kills a few dozen Afghan civilians, for instance, or when U.S. troops are killed, as 8 were over this past weekend, the costs of this failure of imagination are not borne by the people who live in the leafy neighborhoods of Northwest Washington who lunch at the Palm or the Metropolitan Club and who send their kids to Sidwell Friends. So the answer to the question of the hour, what should the United States do about Afghanistan, comes down to this. A sense of realism and a sense of proportion oblige us to take a minimalist approach. As with Uruguay, or Fiji, or Estonia, or other countries where U.S. interests are limited, the United States should undertake to secure those interests at the lowest possible cost. What might this mean in practice? General David Petraeus, commander of the United States Central Command, recently commented, quote, that the mission is to ensure that Afghanistan does not again become a sanctuary for al-Qaeda or other transnational extremists, end of quote. And he went on to say that this requires us to deny them safe havens in which they can plan and train for such attacks. The mission statement is a sound one. The approach to accomplishing this mission, currently on offer, an open-ended counterinsurgency campaign, is not sound, and indeed it qualifies as folly. Denying al-Qaeda safe havens has not required the United States to occupy the frontier regions of Pakistan, and it should not require the United States and its allies to occupy and remake the entirety of Afghanistan. The reality is that as long as we maintain adequate defenses, al-Qaeda poses no more than a modest threat to U.S. national security. As for the Taliban, unless and until they manage to establish enclaves in places like New Jersey or Miami, the threat they pose to the United States will fall several notches below the threat posed by Cuba, which is no threat at all. As for the putatively global threat posed by violent Islamic radicalism, that project will prove ultimately to be a self-defeating one. What the Islamists have on offer, a rejection of modernity, doesn't sell, as the recent events in Iran have, I think, vividly demonstrated. Time is on our side, not theirs. The ethos of consumption and individual autonomy will conquer the Muslim world as surely as it conquered what was once known as Christendom. It's the wreckage that the collapse of Christendom left in its wake that demands our attention. If the United States today has a saving mission, it is to save itself. Speaking in the midst of another unnecessary war back in 1967, Martin Luther King got it exactly right when he said, "Come home, America." The prophet of that era, who urged his countrymen to take on what he called the triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism, remains today the prophet we ignore at our peril. That Barack Obama should fail to realize this qualifies as not only ironic, but inexplicable. Thank you very much.
I think the spirit of tonight is to get right into questions. I want to take a few minutes just to introduce some of the work that I did in Afghanistan this summer and to share with you what GlobalPost is, just as a basis for us to begin our conversation together. I was a longtime foreign correspondent at the Boston Globe, and as we all know, newspapers are suffering these days. It's a great challenge to all of us who care about getting what we call ground truth at GlobalPost, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But if you care about ground truth, you need newspapers, you need networks, you need reporters who are on the ground with good sets of eyes and as much background and experience as possible to share those stories with you. The Boston Globe, sadly, because of a lot of economic reasons, has had to make some hard decisions. They had to cut their entire foreign staff. They no longer have a foreign editor. They don't have any foreign correspondents. The kind of work that I did for a decade for the Boston Globe doesn't happen anymore. And I know that the editors and publisher of the Boston Globe are as sad about that as I am. But it's a reality. And it's a reality at the Philadelphia Inquirer. It's a reality at the Chicago Tribune. It's a reality at the Miami Herald. It's an increasing reality at the LA Times. And it really hurts our democracy. So GlobalPost is an effort to turn the tide, to try something new. We are a fully online news organization at globalpost.com. We have 75 foreign correspondents in 60 countries. We are a very modest startup with a large ambition, which is to try to cover the world. One of the most ambitious reports that we've done at GlobalPost was this summer. I went to Afghanistan predicting that this would be a fateful decision for this administration. We went with a team of writers, photographers, videographers, and we went out to try to look at Afghanistan in all of its complexity, to start over, essentially, to begin to unpack this story anew. And I did that by going with a photographer, Seamus Murphy, and a team of correspondents who have a lot of experience there. I began covering the Taliban in 1995, and I went back to the same madrasa that I first heard about the Taliban in, to see where is that madrasa today. We went and talked to families, a family that Seamus Murphy, a beautiful photographer, has documented for 15 years to understand their single family story and what it tells us about Afghanistan. And it's like time-lapse photography, watching the devastation that has occurred to this family after just decades of war and the loss they've suffered. And now the slow beginning of coming back, of growth, of kids being born, of hope. And one of the things I learned in my journey there, going back to Afghanistan, was that we can't overlook what we have accomplished there. There have been some considerable accomplishments on the ground that we can get into in the conversation. But I just wanted to share with you that my sense of what's going on in Afghanistan is that we are an empire that doesn't want to admit it's an empire. We are going into Afghanistan, as Andrew pointed out, blind to the history that so many other empires have faced. But I also think there are institutions within Afghanistan that we need to draw on much more carefully. We need to cultivate them. There are local institutions of governance and democracy that we should draw on more. One of the questions I want to put to Andrew is, how do we bring in those tribal regional councils that they have in Afghanistan and make them part of that country's future and help us to open the back door on the way out? I want to invite you to go to GlobalPost, and I want you to really see what we've done in our report, Life, Death, and the Taliban, and become part of that community. You get there by going to globalpost.com, and I really want to invite you to join. So without any further discussion, I want to sit down and we'll begin our conversation with Andrew, and then we will open it up to questions after that. Andrew, it's good to talk with you. I feel like I've called you at so many pivotal points in my reporting, whether it was just before the war started in Afghanistan or just before the war started in Iraq. Your perspective, your sense of proportionality, I think, and how the U.S. military should be responding to the challenges it faces is always informative and helpful. But on this one, right now in Afghanistan, I don't understand exactly where you're coming from. You said you believe, as the Obama administration begins to weigh this fateful decision whether or not to add troops, that it needs to think this through with proportionality. Can you define for us what you mean by proportionality and whether or not you think those troops that are there, 68,000 troops right now, should pull out?
Okay, I'll do my best. Not to push back, well, yes, to push back a little bit at the question. There is a tendency, I think, to pose the issue as either all in or all out. That the choice either in more sort of immediate and practical concerns is either we need to give General McChrystal what he requires to implement this counterinsurgency strategy that he proposes, or, since that's the only practical alternative, in effect, what we will be doing will be to accept defeat and to accept catastrophic consequences. And I tend to resist the notion that there is only one choice. There's just the McChrystal plan. And I begin my analysis, and I tried to suggest this in maybe too smart-alecky a way in the presentation. I begin my analysis by saying, what exactly are our interests there? And I mean it quite seriously when I say that it seems to me that there is this assumption that Afghanistan is a vital national security interest, and I don't think it makes any sense at all. I know we have interests in Afghanistan, but the interest is, I think, fairly easy to define as ensuring that the conditions that existed on 9/11 don't exist again, meaning that that authorities in Afghanistan don't turn a blind eye to or even get in bed with violent jihadists like al-Qaeda. Further, I argue strongly that achieving those limited interests does not require remaking the country. And we need to understand very clearly that that's what the McChrystal proposal, that's what counterinsurgency is all about. Read the McChrystal plan that was leaked to the press, whatever it was, a week or 10 days ago. And it says, in essence, the key to success in a counterinsurgency is securing the population. Now, securing a population is another way of saying winning the hearts and minds. And if you read the details of the plan, securing the population does not simply mean protect them from harm, which in and of itself would be a challenging proposition. Securing the population means to provide the people of Afghanistan with effective governance, economic opportunity, school systems that work, police that are effective and not corrupt, central government institutions in Kabul that work and are viewed as legitimate by the people. That is a monumental task. And again, I don't think we have to accomplish that task to achieve our own interest. Further, it's not clear to me that we possess the wisdom to accomplish that task. You know, I wrote a piece, I think it was in the Washington Post a week ago. And the argument I was trying to make was, look, I'm not a specialist on Islam, but my understanding is that one of the defining aspects of Islam is the conviction that politics and religion occupy the same realm. God is not divorced from politics. God is at the center of politics. I'm not standing in judgment of that view, but I would point out that it is very much at odds with the tradition in the West generally and in this country. We believe, and from our point of view, we believe it with good reason, that religion and politics operate separate spheres. How then, in undertaking this enormous project of bringing Afghanistan to the point where it is a functioning nation state, are we going to reconcile that fundamental difference between us and them? Are we willing to argue that God is central to politics? I don't know how we're going to do that. Moreover, How much is it going to cost? Where's the money going to come from? Who's going to pay? I mean, an hour ago, I was on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, because it was pre-taped, and I was on with this guy, General Jack Keane, this retired four-star general, who's a big proponent of counterinsurgency. And the point I kept asking him, asking through Lehrer, was, come clean with the costs of what you are proposing. I don't mean you can tell me it's going to take 5 years, not 6. I don't mean you can tell me it's going to take $450 billion, not 500. I don't mean you can tell me it's going to take 1,000 American dead versus 1,500. But come clean and acknowledge that the duration of the project is enormous and the bill is going to be huge. We've already spent $1 trillion in Iraq. The Congress, I believe, is currently considering a defense bill which will appropriate or authorize $125 billion for the next year's operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. How many hundreds of billions of dollars are we willing to pay for Afghanistan? And again, where's the money going to come from? The fiscal year that just ended, if I am not mistaken, the federal deficit was $1.8 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office projects trillion-dollar deficits for the next decade. Who's going to pay that bill? I mean, the United States government does have, I don't personally think for a second that moral obligations weigh very heavily in the way policy gets made. But I would argue strongly that there are moral obligations, and the primary moral obligation of those who govern in Washington is to the American people. The oath they take is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. The preamble of the Constitution says that the purpose of this union is to secure the blessings of liberty for the American people and for our posterity. We don't do that if we bankrupt the country in pursuit of military expeditions that are other than absolutely necessary. So it seems to me that there are a whole host of contradictions or things that people conveniently overlook in this regard. And, final point, since I've gone on way too long, final point, there are plausible alternatives to achieving our limited interests. In other words, we don't have to stay there and build a new nation for the next 5 years. One plausible alternative is what's now being called the counterterrorism option. And the counterterrorism option says, establish a system of comprehensive surveillance over the entire country. I'm not suggesting that's a small task. I'm not suggesting that that won't cost money. A comprehensive system of surveillance over Afghanistan, and as intelligence identifies al-Qaeda presence, al-Qaeda activity, al-Qaeda plots, we act either to disrupt or to destroy that activity. That's not going to convert Afghanistan into a liberal democracy, which again, I don't think we have the capability of doing. That could plausibility prevent another 9/11, which is what we ought to be doing.
Let me ask you to unpack a much simpler question. And I'm going to ask you to do it in numbers that are precise. And I'm going to say, fair enough. If my question was, is it 68,000 or more or nothing, that's not a refined question. But we do have 68,000 troops in there now. We do have a presence in a country from which the attack on our country was planned and orchestrated. It's not Fiji. It's Afghanistan, and there are 40 million Pashtuns in the belt between Pakistan and Afghanistan that do, from my reporting on the ground, pose a significant peril to our country if they are allowed to regroup, if al-Qaeda is allowed to regroup, if certain elements of the Taliban are allowed to regroup. I don't think you're arguing a full-out, immediate withdrawal, but I want to know what you are putting forward as proportionate. Would it be the troops we have now? Would it be less than that? Would it be a gradual drawdown? Give us, as precisely and as quickly as you can, your sense of that troop proportionality from your point of view.
It would be far fewer. I mean, again,
Half?
yeah, probably, but I would emphasize that political authorities establish the mission, then political authorities go to their senior commanders and say, okay, tell me how to get this done. I mean, I would go to General McChrystal and say, this is your mission has changed, now please take another 6 weeks and tell me how to get it done. I would anticipate that he would say that a mission that emphasized, that prioritized counterterror would require far, far fewer U.S. troops on the ground. Now, counterterror isn't the only solution. Should we try to build up Afghan security forces? Sure, absolutely. And that requires 10,000, round numbers, I'm guessing, people on the ground in order to do that. There's no question about it. I'm not advocating anything that looks like so-called cut and run. And I'm not advocating ignoring Afghanistan. I'm advocating changing our posture so it's in consonance with the interests. And you and I think, disagree sharply on how great those interests are.
I think we do. I think where we do agree is on the need for clarity of mission. And one of the things that I saw on the ground in talking both with the Afghan government, the U.S. government, Afghan soldiers and police, American soldiers, and just people, Afghan people, is a sense of complete confusion about what is our mission there. If you were advising the Obama administration right now, if you could be brought inside the conversations that are occurring as they begin to shape this policy, and the President of the United States turned to you and said, I'd like for you to tell me what you think is a mission that we can achieve and that is important to achieve in Afghanistan, what is it?
Have in place the capacity to prevent al-Qaeda from transforming Afghanistan once again into a sanctuary from which it could mount attacks. It was striking that General Jones, on whatever TV program he was on yesterday, said that there are, in fact, today very few members of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. I mean, in a sense, if that's true, I have no reason to doubt that that's true, for all practical purposes, the basic mission has been accomplished. What we need to do is to set in place the mechanisms to ensure that that achievement is extended over time. Mm-hmm. And again, from my point of view, that doesn't require nation building.
Okay. I wanted to also just ask you about Afghanistan as a culture is a very sophisticated culture. I've heard you describe it as primitive.
It's a primitive country in terms of its levels of economic development.
True. A very sophisticated country, though, in terms of its culture, its history, its traditions, its literary traditions, its art traditions, and even, I would argue, its traditions of governance and its tradition of resisting empires. How
would you, just out of curiosity, how would you describe the tradition of governance as you reported on it?
I think that it is a participatory democracy that is defined locally on a tribal basis, and I think it's not drawn upon enough by the United States government in trying to affect the change it wants to affect within Afghanistan. Instead, we end up imposing a system that doesn't really function within Afghanistan, and there are people who do work in NGOs and work very hard without much success to convince the American government to pay more attention to those structures as they exist right now. I wanted to ask you about the election, and I wanted to ask you about Karzai and the widespread allegations of fraud, and really confirmed cases of fraud, I think we'd have to say at this point. There seems to be very little dispute that there isn't as many as 1 million votes that were fraudulent. And I saw by one estimate approximately 900,000 of those votes went for Karzai. If you took those votes off the table, it's pretty clear there would be a runoff election with Abdullah, the former foreign minister. Is it your sense that the Obama administration, first of all, is it going to accept the results of this election? And second of all, and it looks like it will, if it does, how much will that complicate the situation on the ground to have a leader of a country who is elected in a very questionable election, even if we're going to hope to carry out the mission as you define it with the troop levels where you would place it?
Well, my reading of the reporting is that yes, the administration is going to accept the outcome of the election because not because they believe the election was legit, but because the consequences of declaring it invalid are more than the administration is willing to stomach at this point. I think it's an enormously consequential issue here. And frankly, it reinforces my view that the counterinsurgency strategy is a dubious proposition. How can we build a nation when at the very core of the political establishment is this corrupt and ineffective and illegitimate governing mechanism? I mean, we chose Karzai, and for a good period of time, it appeared to us that he was going to be the George Washington of a new Afghanistan. And not to engage in the typically flip Vietnam analogy, but it does appear that he's a bit more like President Diem than he is like President Washington. That poses a huge additional barrier to the successful implementation of a counterinsurgency strategy.
I think we'll go to questions in just a minute, so I'm going to ask those of you who do have questions to begin to prepare them and maybe come up to the microphones while I ask one more final question. And the question I guess I really wanted to get into was just, it seems as if what you're proposing is a much more reduced mission, a much more clear mission. But I also want to get into the point of disagreement that we have, which is, does Pakistan and Afghanistan and the Pashtun Belt pose a threat to our country? Is there enough resentment on the part of the United States for abandoning Afghanistan after the long, hard fight that we supported on so many levels for them against the Soviet Union, which they won, and then we almost immediately forgot about them and abandoned the country. Now, we also abandoned Pakistan in that realm. We abandoned both Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the seething resentment that you can feel and touch almost in Afghanistan is right there, and it's in Pakistan. The militant Islamic movements that I've heard come out of that region, the violence they have already perpetrated, the intent to harm the United States seems very clear to me. I wonder how it is possible that you wouldn't see that threat, or perhaps maybe not in the sense that I see it, but give us a sense of what you think that threat is and how best we counter it.
Right. I mean, I would want to urge that we distinguish between intentions and capabilities. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt in my mind that this seething hatred directed towards the United States exists on a very large scale. Why it exists is a complicated question, but we cannot deny that a partial answer to the question is the policies pursued by the United States of America in the greater Middle East over the past 50 years. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that, because it kind of, again, gets back to what is it we think we can accomplish. I mean, were you a citizen of Pakistan today, how seriously would you take professions from U.S. government officials that we are devoted to the well-being of the Pakistani people and we're here for the long run, you can count on us? If I were a Pakistani, I wouldn't believe that for a second. And yet, the presumption that we can bring them around informs the notion of this global war on terror in which we are going to persuade the people of the Muslim world to like us. I mean, were you a citizen of Pakistan today, how seriously would you take professions from U.S. government officials that we are devoted to the well-being of the Pakistani people and we're here for the long run, you can count on us? If I were a Pakistani, I wouldn't believe that for a second. And yet, the presumption that we can bring them around informs the notion of this global war on terror in which we are going to persuade the people of the Muslim world to like us. I think it is several bridges too far.
What do you do when the target continues to shrink, even as the force expands?
Okay. I'd like to just remind the radio audience that you're listening to Cambridge Forum, and we're discussing Afghanistan Revisited with Andrew Bacevich, and I'm Charles Sennott of GlobalPost. Andrew, do you want to take that question?
Erect and maintain robust defenses. Again, the argument here is not that al-Qaeda poses no threat, but my argument would be that it poses unlimited threat. And if we keep the door locked, then they're not going to get in. I mean, we are the United States of America, and they are a few hundred people armed with AK-47s hidden in caves in Afghanistan and mostly in Pakistan. We need not live in fear. We simply need to defend ourselves and then to try to behave as wisely as we possibly can in order to advance our interests and maybe a little bit on the margins actually advance the interests of the globe. And an unending war is not the way to get that done.
Thank you.
I think, just to follow up on that a bit, I find myself nodding my head with you every time when you talk about proportionality in the threat we face, and I agree with that. At the same time, we have the case of this guy, Zazi, the airport shuttle bus driver from Denver, who was arrested gathering up chemicals from beauty supply shops to use in a bombing, which sounds like a ridiculous plot. And you could, on the one hand, say it may embody al-Qaeda on the run, fractured, broken, desperate. But on the other hand, having covered so many bombings like the Madrid bombing, the London subway bombings, the first World Trade Center bombing, which was really a ragtag operation, it doesn't take much for them to pull off something horrific that can kill a lot of innocent people. And I don't know that we can...
Charlie, when I say erect and maintain robust defenses, I really mean robust. Mm-hmm. I mean, to take very seriously in terms of intelligence capabilities, police capabilities. I mean, rather than spend $1 trillion on Iraq, spend $500 billion on the FBI and the Coast Guard and the Transportation Security Administration and so on.
So the attacks that have recently been going on across the globe, in Indonesia, for example, there was a very interesting sort of surgical strike on an al-Qaeda-influenced leader there, or the ones in Yemen, Somalia. That's the kind of strike you think we should be doing. That's the kind of approach to al-Qaeda globally.
Sure, the operation that happened, I guess it's now 2 weeks ago in Somalia, where we, I don't remember the guy's name, but basically it was a hell-born raid. They killed him, they snatched him, they took him out. At least from the newspaper reporting, we did not kill any non-combatants in the course of that operation, which means that therefore, at least in that operation, we avoided the problem of alienating the population and recruiting more jihadis.
Right. Sir, your question.
I have a question for a little more clarity about how you see the relation between realpolitik and moral arguments. So I understand from reading your book and hearing some talks, which I very much appreciate, that you have this sense of tragic limitations on the one hand and hubris on the other. You know, society is a dense fabric of desire and limitation, so we should not be doing these things because we can't do them. But suppose, for the sake of argument, and this may not be worth addressing, and you could say, why not? But suppose we had the power to rebuild these, suppose we could really realize these Wilsonian ambitions. Should we? And at what point does the moral argument come in? Is the moral because we usually think of moral arguments as at least tugging against self-interest. You seem to have found a position where you have a kind of happy pre-established harmony between what is morally required and what is in our interest. And I'm wondering, if they were contingently to tug apart, would you think that we should not be pursuing a Wilsonian program, even if we could? Or how do you see that relation between realpolitik and you've talked about the just war tradition, for example. Is that just a sort of a happy accident that it goes along with realpolitik, or how do you see it?
If we had the capability to save the world, should we try to save the world?
Maybe that's one way of putting it. Yeah. But I mean,
Heck yes.
Save the world means potentially invade other countries, impose our way of life on them. When you talk about a tragic sense of limit, I'm wondering.
Well, I don't think imposing our way of life would be saving the world. I mean,
so then maybe that's not the way to rephrase my question.
In my book, I tried to make the argument that to my mind, the reigning conception of freedom in American society is false. And that makes it that much more absurd, I think, that we should portray the American mission as freeing others, bringing freedom to societies in which there is no freedom. I would like to see us far more conscious of our own sins and to attend to them first. I try to be clear that that doesn't mean that we can simply turn our backs to all of the evil in the world, that there are instances of such horrendous evil where I think we are obliged to act, lest we simply concede the world to be taken over by darkness. And the classic example in our recent history, I think, is the Rwanda case. There we could have acted, not to save Rwanda, not to give democracy to Rwandans, but it seems pretty clear we could have acted in order to put an end to a horrendous slaughter. And I believe we should have done so. I don't think we could have made Rwanda into a garden spot, however.
Okay. Your question, sir.
Professor Bacevich, first I have a comment and a question, which I hope is allowed. You mentioned in connection with Iraq that we suffered the tragic loss of 4,800 of our military people, and I agree that is a tragedy and that we spent $1 trillion. But you didn't mention the cost to Iraq, which I believe was immensely greater than the cost to the United States. It seems to me that's a moral issue that if you had stated it, would strengthen your position.
I concur with everything you just said.
Okay, thank you. Now, my question really has more to do with what the government of Afghanistan asked us to do or permitted us to do when we first went in. I don't remember whether they said it was okay to come in. It was different from Iraq, because in Iraq we overthrew the government. That was one of our major goals. But what was true in Afghanistan, and along the same lines, what do the people want if we can tell?
Well, Charlie will talk for the people, but in terms of the start point, it was, in a sense, analogous to Iraq. We invaded in order to overthrow a government. The government was the Taliban. We forged partnerships, most famously with the so-called Northern Alliance, to enlist Afghans to assist us in overthrowing the Taliban. And at that point, then, we presided over a process to begin to create the kernel of a new government, and virtually the first step was to install Mr. Karzai as the leader of this new entity.
I think that the idea of me trying to answer for the people is pretty outrageous. But I will share with you what I heard very often in villages, in very rural areas in Afghanistan in my years of reporting there. And that is, I think people want security. I mean, I think the greatest desire of the Afghan people is to live a secure life. It's a country brutalized by decades of war. And what they want more than anything is to move forward as a society in a safe environment where their children can grow up and prosper. It's a pretty basic, simple need. The thing that I think the American troops don't get is they will get that security from whoever they believe can deliver it for them. That is how the Taliban rose to power. The Taliban came out of the madrasas in the mid-1990s to countervail the warlords, many of whom are now our allies, who were so brutal, so violent, who were bombing Kabul night and day, who were doing shakedown rackets on the roads, who were creating an environment in which people couldn't do trade, they couldn't live with any security, any sense of life. And the Taliban emerged, and I remember vividly speaking with then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright about how much the Clinton administration supported the Taliban, because it was an honest alternative to the corrupt and brutal warlords. Now people see U.S. troops on the ground. They see them driving at 120 miles an hour right through little villages because they're afraid. But they also see them not interacting with that community. They feel they are creating a sense of insecurity, not the security they claim to want to provide. And I think it shouldn't surprise the military, those who understand the place, that those same villagers will turn to the Taliban if they think they're the ones who will give them the security. That's just a reality on the ground that I've seen and been puzzled to see, that you can find a brilliant military strategist like General Petraeus who can understand that intellectually. But I haven't seen that understood very well in the very complex, small ways you need to understand it on the ground.
Thank you.
Okay, this is another question. I just want to say the questions have been great and they've been precise and to the point. I just want to keep that flowing. So
No
thank
way
you.
I'm going to ask some really rambling. Thank you both for coming. Professor Bacevich, could you describe the extent of our relationship, the U.S. government's relationship with bin Laden during the time when he was there fighting the Russian occupation?
This is not something that I know a lot about. I would simply say that the policy of the United States was to support the people we were calling mujahideen, or we called freedom fighters, I guess. Anybody who was willing to take up arms against the Soviet army in Afghanistan without, I think, asking very many questions about what these people stood for or what they aspired to achieve beyond ejecting the Soviet army from Afghanistan. So I don't know of any particular relationship with Osama bin Laden.
I might try it just to help a little bit on that question. I have covered this story really since the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. And I just want to share with you a little bit of a reporting journey. In 1993, I was a police reporter. I was in Lower Manhattan and heard a loud bang. A crime happened. It was an attempt to bomb the World Trade Center. That crime reporting led me to follow the suspects. This is what we did at the New York Daily News. It was a police beat. And I love the fact that my reporting on what was really nascent al-Qaeda, and none of us saw it at that point, not the FBI, not the CIA, definitely not me as a reporter. So I don't say this in any sense of prescience. But I had a great city editor who sent me to Egypt, and then he sent me to the West Bank, and then he said, why don't you go to the Sudan, since two of the taxi drivers are from there. And when I went there in 1993, there was an Islamic conference. And there was a man in white robes there who everyone referred to as the Emir. A few days later, I'm looking at this is pre-Google, if you can imagine that. And we used to print out clips. And I had a tiny little newspaper clip written by Walter Pincus of the Washington Post. It ran like on page 50. Tiny little thing about the World Trade Center bombing. And it said, there's a man known as Osama bin Laden, a scion of the Saudi construction magnate family, the bin Laden family, who may be responsible as a financier for the World Trade Center bombing. But the CIA, the sources I have, say that's impossible because he was fighting with the United States in Afghanistan against the Soviets and was known as the leader of a battalion and was referred to as the Emir. So I'm thinking, that guy, the Emir, was that him? You know, and so all I knew was like a 6'2" guy and with a long. You have to remember, this is before all of that. very interesting small intersection of history that, yes, that was bin Laden, who I saw at the Islamic conference. Those were Egyptians who surrounded him, his bodyguards at that point. Presumably Zawahiri was there. They had just, sort of gathered at this point. And this was, my timing's a tiny bit off, because I went in 93 to the Sudan where he was then. So he's in the Sudan at that point. He comes over to Afghanistan then, as we know, in 1996 with Zawahiri, when he gets kicked out of the Sudan. That long, tangled connection of bin Laden to the forces that were fighting with the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union, it's very real, it's very rich. You can find Mujahideen fighters who remember him, who are now part of the, quote, Northern Alliance, or who are part of the different aspects of the Mujahideen that are now in power. And they're dismissive of him, that he wasn't a real fighter. They understand fighting. But he was a financier. And one of the most revealing explanations I've ever heard of the Taliban's connection to bin Laden was a description by a former Taliban leader of the now deposed Taliban government said, "You don't understand, we were desperate. The United States had abandoned us. We had come to power over the warlords, and along came this man who offered a leveraged buyout of the government of the Taliban." That, I think, is so interesting, and I think it puts in perspective how bin Laden made his connection with the Taliban. It was purely financial. It was, of course, philosophical and theological, but what it really came down to was he had some money, and they needed it. So I hope that answers
Thanks
a little
a lot.
bit. Okay, next question.
This question gets at money, too. I'm making a ridiculously oversimplified, but I think somewhat hopeful, analogy between Scotland 250 years ago and I'd rather talk about Western Pakistan, so if we can hold that in our minds, but we all know the region we're talking about. Anyway, Scotland used to have tribes that fought each other a lot, and they also had fun, especially in the eastern part of Scotland. They'd run over the border en masse and terrorize the English and steal things, and they stopped doing that. And they stopped doing that at a particular point in time, which is when Scotland began to industrialize. And they industrialized with investment money from England. And literally, there are letters where a laird says, "No, I'm not coming. I've got, they give me money. I have this factory. Things are great." So I think the audience knows about social enterprise and microfinance. And my question about that region is if either of you have an opinion about an investment fund that the U.S. would create and people that it would send who would begin to grow a stake in individualism and libertarianism and in making money among people in those regions, perhaps working with tribes.
So I'm just thinking of Mel Gibson reimagining Braveheart with a sort of Pashtun
that's exactly
flavor to it.
Right, thanks.
But no, I think there is a question there about the history of insurgencies, how they arise, whether it's Scotland or it's the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. There are always economic underlying factors that create insurgencies. I think you would agree, Andrew, and I wonder if you have anything you'd add to what in this case, how did that play out?
Well, I mean, I think it's a question of when and how does modernization happen? And are there cases where an outside force, culturally different, can intrude into an underdeveloped society and, assuming lots of resources and the best will in the world, make things bloom?
It's a good example right now. Vietnam in the last decade, 2 decades.
Oh, well.
That's foreign investment that's, made Vietnam industrialized to a large extent.
Okay,
Well, could I, on that point, I guess I would argue that foreign investment works in Vietnam because the Vietnamese have themselves undergone a journey in which they are increasingly recognizing the benefits of the market as an engine of economic growth. And I suspect, even though I haven't been to Vietnam since 1971, that that is reflected to some degree in changes in the aspirations of individual Vietnamese who maybe want to get rich. And I don't think that in Vietnam or in China or in India or in South Korea or Taiwan, that the creation of those conditions, those prerequisites for economic development were imposed by the outside. In other words, heck yes, once modernity gains hold in the Islamic world, over time, the jihadist threat is likely to subside. And anything we can do to sort of nudge things in that direction, we ought to do. But I would be very skeptical that somehow a great big program created in Washington, D.C., supervised by a bunch of bureaucrats, could somehow descend on Egypt and make Egypt different.
Okay, next question.
Thank you. And by the way, since you were in Vietnam, I think it's the number is that since 1975, when the last helicopter left, over half the population alive now have been born since that day. So it's an incredibly young and vibrant country. I come from a career in NGO work, and that's where my question comes from right now. I appreciate both of your extreme experience and insights that you bring to this issue, but I want to talk for a moment not about nation building, but more on building what you were just saying, and that is how and what do you two think is going on in the Obama administration now besides the military strategy question? For example, what kind of programs, some of which actually happened under the Bush administration, surprise of surprises. I have a 47-year-old son who went to Afghanistan 6 years ago to work with an NGO called Shelter for Life, and he's now has his own NGO that's doing small-scale humanitarian work. And it's very small scale. He's building a bridge, he's building a TB hospital, he's training nurse midwives and building an operating room for the Nurse Midwives Association up in Massoud's area in the northern Takhar province, Taloqan. Do either of you have any thoughts or information about the Obama administration's plans for offering that kind of humanitarian aid as well as whatever they're
Meaning
doing?
specifically through NGOs.
Yes.
It's a huge river of tax dollars that is flowing into Afghanistan and funding an NGO industry that is quite considerable as a sort of business sector in Afghanistan. I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars going into the NGOs. One of the stories that we recently wrote in the special report we did, Life, Death, and the Taliban, was by our correspondent in Kabul, Jean McKenzie, who is an amazing correspondent. And what she found out was the big NGOs are dealing with these $100 million contracts, and there are no accountants to really watch the dollars or where they go. And there's an effort to partner with local subcontractors, a well-intentioned effort to try to give Afghan businessmen and businesswomen, mostly businessmen, a sense of partnership. But the problem is those contracts, as Jean found out, are paying protection money to the Taliban. So, you know, I was recently at the funeral for Gennaro Angiulo in the North End. My office, GlobalPost offices, are very near there. And I just happened to be walking by on the day of the funeral for Gennaro Angiulo, and I thought the former head of organized crime in Massachusetts would be rolling over in his grave because the Taliban gets 20% And he was only getting 10% all these years. And the Taliban is organized crime. And it's a good, healthy way to look at it, I think. Remember, I started on this story as a cop reporter. I still think a lot of understanding the Taliban is to understand it like many insurgency movements. There's a criminal element that funds it. And sadly, the NGOs prey on it. But I want to thank you for your son's service. We say this to military families a lot, but this is a huge service on the part of your son, particularly for working with a small NGO. Because those are the NGOs, from what I hear on the ground, and from what I hear even from USAID officials, is it's the smaller contracts, the smaller NGOs that can really account for what they're doing and actually do quite good work. So it's a huge scale in which the NGOs are being funded, but it's often these smaller approaches like the one your son has been involved in that can have great successes. So I hope that sheds some light. Did you have anything you want to add there, Andrew? Next question.
Yeah, Mr. Sennott, you
Yes.
referred earlier to the existence in Afghanistan of long-standing and sophisticated political structures, based on tribal and ethnic lines.
Yep.
And I think that's an important point to make, but I think it begs a larger question, and that's what's the tradition within Afghanistan of having a coherent and effective central government? And I think the answer to that question is a resounding no, there is no tradition of that. And doesn't that in itself argue against the McChrystal Plan?
That's a great question, and I think Andrew will have a lot to answer that, but I'll start, and then maybe you could jump in, because this is such an important point. One of the organizing bodies that I'm speaking of, actually, is the Loya Jirga, which we remember was the body that brought Karzai to power, essentially. I mean, we may have picked him, but it was the Loya Jirga that confirmed the appointment. I'm wondering, in this period of crisis, in the aftermath of a clearly fraudulent election, what are the local institutions and forums in which decisions could be made on how to proceed? The Loya Jirga is one that I'd like to hear more Afghanis talk about. I'd like to know from the Afghan perspective, is that something that the Afghan people think could be a way for them to resolve what will be a wildly disputed election, which won't allow Karzai to govern at all. He's had a very difficult time, as you point out, because central governments have always had a hard time in Afghanistan, or not always, for most of its history, the vast majority of its history. There are notable exceptions that are often overlooked. But I do think you raise a very important point, and I think this election will weaken him even further. Andrew.
Well, I think, and I'm absolutely not an expert in the history and the political traditions of Afghanistan, but it does seem to me that that tradition is one of decentralization, in which real clout is exercised by these chieftains or warlords, whatever we wish to call them, and that, again, in searching for ways to achieve our limited interests most efficiently and effectively, I think it's worth exploring whether we can contract out governance to the warlords. To some degree, the analogy here, I think, is to the so-called surge in Iraq. I think we know now that a key component of the surge was paying Sunni insurgent leaders to put down their arms and make common cause with the United States. So I wonder if it would not be possible for us selectively to provide similar incentives to some of these warlords and get them to carry our water to some degree.
Next question. I should say we have a few minutes left. There are about 4 or 5 minutes. So maybe if I could propose that we sort of ask real quick questions, and we'll try to get to all 3 of these remaining questions. And we'll try to do rapid-fire answers. So, sir.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. To get us out of Afghanistan, isn't it really important to understand why we're there? I mean, I'm concerned with Professor Bacevich's analysis that we're there because of Wilsonian idealism. Isn't it really true that there are some Americans that have an interest in controlling the greater Middle East? Isn't it about oil? Isn't it about empire? Don't we have 700 military bases throughout the world? Don't we need to blow up these weapons from time to time in order to get contracts to build new ones? And finally, don't we need a ideological opponent to mobilize our population behind all this policy? Communism out, terrorism in.
Okay, Andrew.
The Bush administration advertised its purposes as Wilsonian, but their true purposes, in my judgment, were more accurately classified as imperial.
Okay, very short question.
Yes, thank you. I had hoped to ask you this question in person, but I didn't want to take any more of your time. The theme of the question is going to be a little different, and I think that the answer won't take very long. I did a couple tours in Iraq in 05, 06, and 07, 08, and I came away from it very disillusioned, feeling that we did more harm than good. I was in the 101st, and we both times were slated to go to Afghanistan, but it ended up happening. And lately, I've been out for about 6 months, and I really can't get it off my mind. I was kind of a bit of an idealist before and during my enlistment, and it was very tough to become disillusioned in Iraq. And I know you've kind of covered it and summarized it already, and it might kind of be rhetorical for your answer, but basically, you're second to none in your expertise of understanding American history. And for me, you know, if I knew, if I could understand or see some truth that we would not be making the world a better place, or be helping people by continuing the current strategy over there, because I wouldn't be going SF, I'd still be in light infantry. And B, would we truly be making America a safer place or a less safe place? And yours and others' answers to those questions are going to greatly affect my decision. So I'm very interested in kind of overall, if you could kind of give me your opinions on it. I know you already have already, but
well, I don't know what I can say. I mean, I believe that service to country is an honorable calling, and that the honor that accrues to you in serving your country is quite independent of the policies that the country is pursuing. You have no say in those policies. It's not your job as a soldier. It's partly your job as a citizen. It's not your job to decide what the policies are. So in my own life, I try to cling to the conviction that if I did my best, that that's good enough, and that I should not get hung up on any lies that Lyndon Johnson told or that Robert McNamara told. I did my best. I assume you did your best, and I think that's enough.
If I could just follow up very briefly, I guess I would just ask your opinion honestly, if you believe that if we continue with the current strategy and the troop expansion, if you believe we will succeed, or if you believe that we will make the world a less safe place.
I believe that if we execute the McChrystal strategy, that we will fail, and we will fail at enormous cost to this country in terms of lives and of treasures. That's why I oppose that project.
Thank you.
Thanks. That's an excellent question. Last question of the evening.
This is a comment and then a question. Professor Bacevich, at the beginning, when you referred to the events of 9/11, I noticed that you used a politically incorrect term. You used conspiracy. So I was wondering exactly what you meant by that, because it's a term which is not supposed to be used, even if you're applying it to the official government conspiracy theory as promulgated by the 9/11 Commission. I also got the impression that you thought it might have been the events of that day were the result of the U.S. military sort of being caught with its pants down. They weren't ready. Not only the military, but the whole billion-dollar defense and security apparatus of the United States on that one day simply had a major failure.
Well, no, the
Another
national
guy.
security apparatus failed on September 11th, but had the attack happened on September 10th, it would have failed then too, because the national security apparatus was not focused on the task of defending Manhattan and Washington, D.C., as it should have. I didn't know that the term conspiracy was politically incorrect. I do believe that there were conspirators within this organization called Al-Qaeda that put together that operation and, alas, executed it quite successfully.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Professor Andrew Bacevich,
Thanks
for
a
this
lot.
evening.
It was fun.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.